Welcome to Parallax.
All right, so welcome to the Parallax podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Mark. This will be the first episode of a short mini-series on the issue of war. And with me today is Jim Rutt, former chairman of the Santa Fe Institute, initiator of the GameB, and of course, the host of the popular podcast show, the Jim Rutt Show. Welcome, Jim.
Yeah, glad to be here, Tom.
So you're here because I asked on your forum, I asked a simple question, and it went something like this. So we're always talking a lot about emergence and complexity and development of consciousness and culture. And I saw you just put on the first video for the GameB community. And we never talk about the nitty-gritty of reality, which is war. And by war, I mean not a certain political issue right now or like a current conflict, but war in general. And you mentioned multipolar traps as an aspect of it. And so I asked you to elaborate on that. And the question, do we need war? Is war necessary? Is war inevitable? Is it even desirable to live in a world without war? And I know these are kind of contentious and very difficult questions, but that's why you are here for. So, Jim, what do you say?
Well, actually, in the GameB analysis, we've been spending a fair bit of time thinking about this question, right? And in fact, I've identified the somewhat excuse me. No, I have a little cough here. Somewhat disturbing fact that not only war is bad and dangerous and potentially the terminating event itself, but it also locks in and scaffolds other bad multipolar traps. So let's start with the first part, though, which is, why is war itself so bad at the present time and something we really have to get our handle around? If you look at data like from Steven Pinker, the rate of wars have actually gone down relatively rapidly in the world in the 20th century. Excuse me. However, the magnitude of wars has gone up. Think of World War II as the canonical biggest war so far. Should we have a general nuclear war, China and Russia against England, France, United States, Israel, something like that, would absolutely dwarf World War II. And so it would be if not human race terminating event, it would be an advanced civilization terminating event. So the superpower that humans have developed since Hiroshima, basically, have made war a existential risk, at least to advanced civilization. And we keep rolling the dice every year, hoping it doesn't happen. But if we know anything about, the statistics of Poisson distributions, which is very much the way like radioactivity work, you keep rolling the dice. Sooner or later, you're going to come up snake eyes. 5 bad decisions will get made in a row. The nukes will fly, and that'll be that. So for that reason alone, we need to back away from the game of war. But the second one is more subtle. And this is actually how I came to even be thinking about the game of war, which is one of our core tenets in GameB, is that we can't continue with the exponential economic growth pattern, at least not the way it's currently defined, in a finite world, right? It's not that hard of a concept. Exponential growth in a finite world has to stop at some point. However, as a multipolar trap locks in the economic one. Since about 1870, maybe 1860, so the U.S. Civil War, certainly the Franco-Prussian War, military power has become roughly correlated with economic power. And if you're caught in a military multipolar trap, then you must continue to drive your economy ahead rapidly, or you will not have the industrial capacity, the inventions, the technologists to be able to fight, war at scale. And if anything, it's probably more true today and permeates more areas. For instance, the drive by the U.S. and China in the AGI race is partially is locked in by the military multipolar trap. Even though, for humanity's sake, it would probably be wiser to slow down a bit and make sure we get the safety stuff in place before we push ahead to human level and beyond human level AI. Well, if we don't do it, the Chinese will do it, and the Chinese are probably saying the same. I know we're saying the same thing about us. If we don't do it, the Americans will do it. So we're locked in. So
could you just, for the listeners, I mean, I know you just did it, but to be more precise, what is the multipolar trap? Just that we're all on the same page here.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. Let me describe what is a multipolar trap. And this is an idea that I picked up from Daniel Schmachtenberger. He may have coined it, I don't really know. But the idea is when there's a group of people acting in some linked fashion where they're more or less competitive, and the behavior by one potentially destabilizes the situation and forces all the others to respond in a way that is collectively adverse, even though none of them, or maybe only one of them, would actually want to. Let me give you a real simple everyday example. Suppose you're a young management consultant working at McKinsey or something, right? And you start to figure out that one of the guys who's also a young associate and competing for that very desirable partner slot, has started to take Adderall, which is basically a amphetamine. It's a speed type drug, which does give you greater endurance and greater mental acuity, or at least the ability to focus. However, it also disrupts your sleep patterns, changes your brain in a bunch of weird ways, makes it difficult to enjoy things, ahedonia. It's got all kinds of bad effects. However, at the margin of competing to be considered as a partner at McKinsey, taking Adderall is probably a competitive advantage. So you know that Mary in the cubicle next door is hitting the Adderall, and you're saying, shit, I'm being left behind. So you have to start taking the Adderall. And then Charlie, the guy in the next cubicle, says, oh, Mary and Jim are taking Adderall. I got to take Adderall. And then the whole cubicle farm of young associates are all doing this dangerous but
the whole
capacity.
office degrades, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the whole office then degrades. And then this is the very important thing about the multipolar trap. Nobody can stop.
Right.
If I were to stop, I'm just at a massive I'm at a competitive disadvantage to everybody else. So we're all locked in. And that is the essence of the multipolar trap, essentially, where you're in a situation where one person's actions leads to a chain reaction where everybody is locked into a situation that they can't back out of, even though collectively it's bad for them.
Right. Okay. So the thesis is that when we are waging war, or when we go into war, we're locked in a multipolar trap. And it means that the system degrades because we're like in a competitive kind of, standstill.
Let me back up just a little bit, clarify. Yeah. Not necessarily talking about war per se when active war is in happening, but rather the situations that lead to war, which is the arms race, the military buildups, alliance systems, etc. When war itself breaks out, that's a different class of thing. But if we don't have the precursor to war, we won't have war. At least we won't have these major, potentially civilization-ending wars. And so that's what I mean when I talk about the multipolar trap. The U.S. is spending X percentage of its GDP on military. China has to meet that. Oh, the Chinese have now accelerated. We got to accelerate. Think about the arms race going on between Ukraine and Russia. And it's one of both industrial scale and innovation. Both sides are doing some innovative things. And so that's the part that I think we really have to focus on. War itself, oddly enough, is almost incidental to the multipolar trap that leads to war. And right. I think that's the critical part. If we can break the multipolar trap that leads to arms races, to buildups of capacity, development of extremely dangerous things, then war will either not break out at all, or it'll be at a much lower scale. If we had wars with swords and spears, it would be kind of ugly. I mean, being stuck in the guts with a spear is a pretty horrible way to die, but it would not be an existential threat to our civilization. But through this series of arms races in this multipolar trap, we've reached the point where yes, sure enough, we could bring down civilization.
Right. Okay, so the issue that I have and the question that I originally had was, I mean, obviously everybody wishes for world and peace and for no wars and no arms race and to escape somewhat this multipolar trap. But a look into history shows, well, the more developed we become, we became religious, and then we entered the age of secularism and democracy and humanism and the modernity, and it showed that these were the most violent and horrific times that we ever endured. I mean, you just mentioned, the Second World War, the First World War, the Vietnam War. The 20th century was full of wars. And so one has to ponder if there's not a evolutionary driver within war, because obviously there are some cultural and you mentioned technological developments that are basically instigated through war, even in philosophy and education and all these kind of things. And so the question is, if the system really degrades, and I know this is a hard question and a controversial question because we normally don't want to think about these things, but are the net effects of a war always a degrading of the system? That's the question.
Well, obviously not necessarily. And of course, it depends on the domain, right? Let's think about World War II, for example, the canonical huge war. On one side, Europe, Western Europe was smashed flat. The Russian people lost 20 million people. Japan was smashed flat. 2.5 million civilians were killed by American firebombing raids even before the nukes were dropped. So at the material level, clearly a huge amount of bad things happened. Europe and Japan didn't really recover for 20 years till the mid 60s, until their economic power had recovered. But there was some benefits for humanity. The development of jet engines was accelerated. The invention of rockets that could eventually take us to the moon was accelerated. There were huge advances in antibiotics during World War II. There were advances in miniaturization of radio, etc. So there's multiple dimensions, right? There's
computer technology, rockets,
yeah.
Even the Santa Fe Institute, the NASA, the Frankfurt School in philosophy. You have it's like there's barely any sector in society that wasn't affected by the Second World War.
Indeed, it was a huge shock wave. It was a compression of time, space, and energy, where people accomplished things they would not normally have accomplished. Consider the Manhattan Project in the U.S. Countries like Iran have spent decades trying to build nuclear weapons. The U.S., without any computers, without any computer-controlled machine tools, built nuclear weapons in 2.5 years. It's fucking amazing, right?
Yeah.
Why? Because of the impetus of war. So that shock wave does produce some useful things. On the other hand, if we keep assuming that major wars keep getting of a bigger and bigger magnitude, it's hard to say that the benefits would be greater than the loss. Suppose we did have a general nuclear war and 4 billion people were killed, and essentially everything about the modern world was destroyed. I don't care how much innovation you got. I kind of doubt it would be worth paying that price.
And nobody wants to live in a world ruled by Nazis, no? So there's also like an ideological kind of thing that we adopted, the American.
Well, it's not quite true. Nazis would like to live in a world dominated by Nazis.
Well, that's true.
Right? And there are Nazis everywhere. Even the United States has got its own little bit of Nazis, right?
All right. Okay.
And also, it's very important, and this is why it's a multipolar trap. It's very important to realize that everybody thinks they are the good guys, right? Hitler got out of bed in the morning saying, I'm a good guy, I'm righteous, what I'm doing is good for Germany and good for the world, right? And people often forget that. They somehow think that these people are evil monsters who are out to, like a James Bond villain or a Batman villain, out to do evil. No, everybody thinks they're the good guy. And that's very important, actually, to understand the nature of the multipolar trap.
So how inbuilt into our society is the multipolar trap? I mean, I know you're working with, overcoming GameB and trying to model a game B for our society. But in terms of, the multipolar trap, I guess you would say it's a game A, right?
No, I would say it's fundamental to all existence, basically. Right.
Okay.
The danger always exists, right? And so you need to consciously look at methods to overcome the natural multipolar traps that will otherwise arise. Game B will also be subject to the possibility of being pulled into various multipolar traps. And so this is not something like smallpox that you can get rid of once and for all. It's going to be an ongoing, it'd be more like the flu, a constant battle against the emergence of bad multipolar traps. And that's just the way the nature of the universe is.
Right. Okay. Elaborate on that.
In which in the game B world, while we'll have certainly some attributes that lessen certain kinds of multipolar traps, whenever there's any kind of competition for scarce resources, which there always will be, there will always. Let me give you an example. Under game B is a radically decentralized social operating system where individual communities are reasonably autonomous, though they nest within higher level membranes, and they compete, quote unquote, by attracting members, right? And one could imagine there being a tension to attract members into these communities by consuming more resources, right? For instance, life is is better in this membrane than in that membrane because they're consuming more energy, let's say, to keep it simple. And so that multipolar trap exists in a game B world. So how do you potentially adjust that, which is you have an accord, as we call it, an agreement not to do X that defuses the multipolar trap. In this case, and this is a thought piece, we haven't yet officially put it into the game B doctrine, not that there is any official game B doctrine, which is that suppose we all agreed to limit our societies to 4,000 watts, the equivalent of continuous power of 4,000 watts, 24/7, which, by the way, is about the equivalent of Portugal. Portugal's not a horrible place at all, right? And particularly if we used our very best thinking, we could have very good quality of life, human well-being at the Portugal level of energy consumption. And if everybody in game B agreed to limit the per capita energy consumption to 4,000 watts continuous, that breaks the multipolar trap of competing on energy consumption. Now, of course, that then requires some mechanism of enforcement, which would be, say, for instance, an annual energy audit of every game B membrane and a publishing of the results. Okay, how many people do you got? How much energy did you consume? Have you exceeded the agreed upon accord that we're all going to limit our energy? So there's an example of the fact that the multipolar trap can always exist, and a series of accords and information and enforcement mechanisms have to be in play to prevent the multipolar, or to mitigate the emergence of the multipolar trap.
Right.
Welcome to Parallax, the resurrection of truth, beauty, and goodness. Parallax, a media war engine. Parallax, the construction amidst eternal decay. Parallax, the portal to the edge of chaos. Parallax, poem and provocation. Parallax, mad philosophers and tantric demigods. Parallax, totem for an unknown god. Parallax, philosophy and the return of the matriarch. Parallax, the end of the meaning crisis. Parallax, the whispering daemon in your ear. Parallax, the god of wisdom, wine and love. Parallax, your home for superior publications, podcasts and courses. Parallax, join us today.
What do you mean?
No, I mean, it's like, so you have an organization that regulates energy consumption around the planet, right?
Well, we have an agreement that we will all stay within in the game B bubble. We will consume energy no more than X per capita at each level, right? And we would have agreements. And interestingly, at least in theory, the only GameB sanction is expulsion. So if your membrane violates the accord for extended period of time and refuses to take any action to mitigate it, you'll get expelled from GameB. Go do your own thing. You're not part of our world. We won't trade with you. You won't be part of our intellectual patent collection.
But how do you make sure that there's not a fraction that goes to war with this very organization that
Okay, that's a whole different class of problems.
No, because it's again the question of war. Now, and how do you escape the multipolar trap
of war, right? And at the theory level, we call this what constitutes an evolutionary stable strategy. If you look at computer simulations of things like iterated prisoner's dilemma, you can find that nice strategies like never attack, never even a Jesus strategy, don't even respond if attacked. If the whole world were implementing the Jesus strategy, there would be no war. Unfortunately, if a single player defects and becomes the anti-Jesus, the Jesus strategy has no defense against them.
Right.
And so you need to have a strategy that can exist with the emergence of cheaters, right? You have a way to suppress cheaters. In iterated
that's Axelrod, isn't it? It's like tit for tat, and the bad guys always have a winning strategy in relationship to the good guys. That's
until tit for tat is approximately an evolutionary stable strategy. Turns out there's some slightly better strategies. And tit for tat basically says never attack, but if attacked, always respond with one round of attack. And so it is possible to develop so-called ESSs, evolutionary stable strategies, that sanction cheaters at a level that suppresses cheating, but doesn't explode into war of all against all. And at least roughly in the GameB world, one of the ideas that's being floated is that we should include it as part of our top level accords, our main very small constitution, that an attack on one is an attack on all. Kind of the NATO strategy. Article 5 of NATO basically says you attack any NATO country, all other NATO countries must come to your defense. Right. And if there were, let's say, 300 million GameB people around the world, probably running a few small countries and being significant minorities in other countries, high economic linkages amongst them, lots of economic power. Any country, anybody, any group that fucks with a GameB entity has to deal with all the GameB entities, because it will be like Article 5 of NATO, and we will be obliged to come to their assistance. And I will say, things like NATO are an interesting precursor to how to prevent war. Nobody's attacked a NATO country, right? And for good reason. You attack even a little one. You attack Latvia. And you have to fight the United States. You have to fight Britain. You have to fight Germany, right? And collective defense could work, and in the case of NATO, has worked. So we think that provides an interesting clue for the future of how GameB can exist even in a hostile world, even with enemies and potentially internal defectors. The other thing we have to always understand is that humans are not perfect. People and organizations can and will go bad. It's always important to remember about 1% of humans are sociopaths. And you find a charismatic sociopath, and they're going to lead other people astray. It will happen at a statistically predictable rate. And so your social operating system has to keep that in mind and be prepared to intervene in the same way a healthy body. Human cells go cancerous all the time, right? There are millions of cells in your body going cancerous, breaking the rules and reproducing against the rules of the body. However, the body immediately responds and kills those cells. And the only time when cancer becomes a problem is when the self-regulation systems break down and the cancer expands beyond the size for the swarming defense to defeat it. And that analogy also, I believe, is useful in the GameB world. That the instant someone goes rogue, just squash them.
Right. Okay. So let me nevertheless ask you in this context and play a little bit the advocatus diaboli, because we talked about, well, the negative effects, obviously, that we, the horrific dehumanizing effects of war and these kinds of games. And then, of course, you had, and we briefly touched upon this, all the kind of developments you had, through the shock wave of war, culturally, technologically. And so the question would be then how, because war is so intrinsic and so all-encompassing and touching society, how would you account for new developments if the driving force of war is took out of the equation, right? Because you could make the case that we're doing war for so long, since we basically became human, that it's so part of our way of dealing with the world, of developing ourselves, developing culture, that there is, as strange as it sounds, that there's wisdom in that. Right. And so how do you account for our development on every societal level if you take out war?
And yeah, and as we talked about previously, it's highly multidimensional. Yes, it produces innovation in some areas at cost in others. On the other hand, our world seems to be advancing even when we're not in war. There seems to be something about humans that they want to move forward, at least since the Enlightenment. And truthfully, I'd be happy if we move forward a little bit more slowly, right?
Right.
The fact that we're rushing to the edge of the cliff at an exponentially increasing speed is actually a bad part of Game A. If the elimination of war slowed that down and allowed us to bend the economic growth curve, just keep in mind, the economic exponential is tightly linked to the military multipolar trap. If you're in the multipolar trap, you cannot back off from the exponential economic accelerator.
Right.
And if you break the military multipolar trap, then you have at least the chance to bend the curve, at least at the material consumption side of economics. This is something that people mistake. That's why I hate the term degrowth, right? Fuck those people, right? We want growth in quality. What we don't want is growth in gross consumption. So, for instance, maybe I only need 5 shirts. Maybe I don't really need 50 shirts and buying new ones all the time, fast fashion. But maybe I want to have my friend, the embroidery lady, embroider the story of my life in my shirts, right?
Right.
So my shirt has gotten richer, more work, more smarts are being applied to something, but we haven't consumed more material resources. And so we can grow into the microcosm, into richness, into art, into loveliness, into all the things that make human well-being improve without increasing beyond a reasonable base level rate of material consumption that's beyond the sustainable capacity of the earth to maintain over time. And that's the Game B vision. So we don't think of it as a static society with a bunch of hippies in mud huts. We think of it as a world that continues to evolve forward with innovation in all levels, of all sorts. In fact, one of the things I regularly say is Game B is not worth building if society is no longer capable of doing things like the long baseline gravitational sensing system that allowed us to detect gravity waves, which was a 30-year project spread across many countries, and humanity was able to organize itself to do that, and it was for an entirely peaceful purpose. Absolutely no possible military application,
Right.
at least within a million years, right, to be able to detect gravity waves from very remote astronomical phenomena. And yet humanity was able to do that. And so Game B has to be able to coordinate at scale if it's going to be worth pursuing. I definitely don't want humanity to give up on its advancements, but it wouldn't bother me at all for it to slow down, in fact, we have to slow down in the gross aspect. We just have to. There's no way around it. But breaking that military multipolar trap and its linkage to the economic multipolar trap are important steps to make that occur.
I mean, it will take time to implement Game B. If you correlate,
at least 60 years.
Do we have that time in your estimation?
Well, we'll find out. Now, I do say that 60 years is the long road to game B. However, we keep in mind in our thinking that as things get worse in game A, more people will want to come into game B. And so game B needs to be able to grow pretty rapidly, particularly as game A starts to totter. And if game A were to actually go into full-on crisis of collapse, if it happens too early, game B probably can't save the day. If it happens, say, in 30 years, 25 years, it may well be that even full-on collapse could be absorbed into game B. Don't know. Fortunately, full-on collapse is relatively unlikely in the next 60 years, I would argue, unless some exogenous event occurs, an asteroid strike or a massive solar flare that takes down the whole worldwide grid, or war at a sufficiently devastating scale. And it might not even be a state actor war, unfortunately. It could be a terrorist with a amazingly powerful bioweapon,
Right.
As an example. You cross something that's very, very virulent like measles or late stage COVID, and you add in the lethality of Ebola or something like that, right? And you could kill off half the population of the world, and that might well cause the full-on collapse. So anyway, we have to be prepared to design the long road, but be prepared to be adaptive should things really go to shit in game A, and hope, fingers crossed, that game A can hold together for long enough for game B to peacefully replace it.
Right.
And I think if think about the other big transitions in our recent history, a huge transition, about maybe not quite as big, but almost as big as the transition from game A to game B, was the collapse of the Soviet Union and its satellite states, right? Civilization didn't end. Now, the Russian people got 50% poorer for a while, but they're now back above where they were before. The Eastern European countries very quickly adapted to the non-Soviet model, and some of those are amazing examples of prosperity. Countries like Poland and Slovenia and the Baltics, etc. So even with major fluctuations in game A, say at the scale of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that does not necessarily imply that advanced civilization itself would collapse.
Right.
That's very important to keep in mind. I will say this too. We do have to assume that there is a risk out on the right tail of total collapse, but collapsism in the short term, I think, is generally a bad attractor for people's brains. We tend to over-index on it sometimes in the social change world. We need to be prepared for it, assume it's got some probability, but work assuming that probably it's low probability in the short term. It's high probability in the long term. The question is, what is long term? What is short term? And I suspect 60 years is still within the relatively short term.
I still wonder how intrinsic the warrior and waging war is to human nature, and I haven't found a concrete answer yet. Because incidentally, I was just reading Nomadology, The War Machine by Guattari and Deleuze. I don't know if you're familiar with that text.
I'm familiar with the title, but I have not read it.
Well, it's basically the idea that, in order to form a state, you need, an interiority between the king and the archetypal king and the archetypal priest. And then you have a third archetype or, form as the warrior that is always an exteriority that challenges and charges the state and the priest and the king. And so and that war and the war machine was basically invented by these warriors like Achilles, for example, that like nomads that are outside the state and are hated by the state, but also kind of needed by the state in order to occupy land and and spaces. And so this is like a primordial archetype. So I suspect that we can't get rid of them. But from a game B perspective, like what would the game B could offer them?
Who's the them? The One of the things that we talk
Well,
about
the warrior type archetypes, these people these Achilles,
I'm not so concerned about the warriors because I think warriors can do lots of other things with their energy. One of the ones we pay more attention to in the GameB world is what Chris Boehm, the anthropologist, calls big men, right? They aren't necessarily the warriors, but they're the ones who are driven by the need for self-gratification in terms of power and authority. And An extraordinarily interesting book called Hierarchy in the Forest lays out what he describes as the primordial human social operating system at the forager level, where the forager people did not tolerate big men. And in fact, he lays out, he's an anthropologist going through the anthropological literature, and he says basically it starts with the foragers. Someone decides they want to be a big man, they have the right genes to be a big man. I think a fair bit of it is genetic. Fortunately, it's relatively rare, but not that rare. Maybe it's 1%. So first people ignore him. Someone starts, the big man starts ordering people around. They ignore him. If he continues, they laugh at him. If he continues further, they convene a council and tell him to stop. If he continues, they exile him. If he comes back, they kill him. And this was the human operating system of our 300,000 years, probably 290,000 years. We operated on this system of an immune system against the big man. And it was really quite amazing because it's contrary to our genetic heritage. We are descendants from a very hierarchical animal, the precursor to the chimpanzee and the bonobo. Both the bonobo and the chimpanzee are hierarchical and have big men, and in the bonobo case, big women, right? And
right.
So we have and he goes into the book and makes the argument we almost certainly have the genetic tendency towards this, but the social operating system of the forager defeated it. And we take that as a very hopeful sign that we can keep big men away from the levers of power. And just not tolerate it and understand the pattern and see it. Of course, we have a counterexample here in the United States where the most cartoon caricature, idiotic version of the big man is now about to take the levers of power for the whole country. So we certainly have failed in late stage game A. I mean, late stage game A is now getting comically absurd. I mean, to elect a shitbird like Trump to the presidency is just like, what the fuck? What would the founding fathers say? Well, they specifically warned against this pattern, right? So game B has to build in from the beginning a strong immune system against big men. And I think it's big men that's the problem, not the warrior. And Achilles, it's funny, I just read two different translations of the Iliad in 2023. And Achilles is actually more of he's a king of his country. What the fuck's going on?
Can you repeat that? The last sentence was lost in electronic transmission, basically.
And my computer's having a little fit here. Achilles is not just a great warrior; he's also a king, right? He's the king of his country, and he has his army, the Myrmidons, etc. So I would say Achilles, and he's full of ego with Agamemnon, and very tetchous little fucker, right? And so he's more of a big man than he is actually a warrior. Well, there are other Diomedes and his buddy Patroclus; those guys are pure warriors. But pure warrior energy can be focused on other things. Let's go to Mars, right? It's the big men who are looking for self-aggrandizement. Aren't I great, right? That are the real problem, not the warriors.
Well, I don't know if you ever had Christopher Ryan on your show. He wrote a couple of great books, Sex at Dawn and Civilized to Death, and he plays a lot about this, the conflict amongst the anthropologists. Do we descend from the chimpanzees more, or from the bonobos? Because obviously the bonobos, have conflict resolutions that are more based on sex, and more, while the chimpanzees, they go to war with other chimpanzee tribes.
I would bet on that because we're not descendant from either the chimps or the bonobos, right? We are descendant from the creature that led to both the chimps and the
Right.
bonobos and the humans. So to say that we're one or the other is fallacious, but we certainly have genetic tendencies in both directions. Though if I were a betting man, I'd say a bit more on the chimp side than the bonobo side.
Well, okay. So there you have the problem. So what do you do with that genetic side?
That's the social operating system. That's the Chris Boehm Forager operating system against the big man. So you have, from the beginning, you have the knowledge that there are people who want to be big men, and you build your governance modalities to keep those big men from having too much power.
What, but I mean, we were talking about classics. Platon famously said that this is an inbuilt problem of democracy itself, that democracy promotes the big man, basically, because if you give everybody the same voice, these people who have a bigger voice because they pretend to be bigger, they will accumulate more people listening to them. And so for Platon, it was that after democracy, always a tyranny will follow. So there's a cycle going on that we are subjected to basically for ages now.
And that's why GameB has got to be a new operating system.
Yes, okay.
Literally an operating system. If the foragers could do it for 290,000 years, isn't it possible that we could develop a new operating system that is self-aware of the danger of big men? And we almost certainly don't have, a shit show democracy like the West has today. I mean, this is like ridiculous. This is not a reasonable way to govern a society. Who
Right.
was that clown? The Brits elected Johnson. What the fuck? Right.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, he's an impressive guy in some ways, but should never have been given the job. Trump. What the fuck? Right. And who knows what's going to happen in France? Right. And so.
No, because he came from the Eton kind of ruling class, that Churchill brought forth. And so, Britain, in search of their identity, loved the idea that one of those people come back into office. So,
he gave a 3-minute speech to Parliament in classical Greek. Very impressive.
There you go. Yeah. He was very verbatim. Yes. Mm.
Yeah. So anyway, there's clearly something broken in our governance modality, and GameB is not at all committed to representative democracy. And in fact, one of the big pieces of work that we've laid out for ourselves are developing governance modalities where everybody has voice, but it may well not look at all like representative democracy. In fact, one of the ideas that I'm interested in, I've written about it a fair bit. I don't necessarily endorse it, or at least I endorse trying it. I don't know if it'll work at scale. It's something called liquid democracy, where everybody has an equal vote, but I can proxy my vote to somebody else and assume something like 30 issue areas, right? We have a vote for law, we have a vote for war, we have a vote for health, we have a vote for the environment, we have a vote for science, and I have 30 votes, classes of votes that I can give, and I can pass them on to somebody else. And presumably, if I'm a wise person, even only not a very smart, but a little bit wise person, I pass those votes on to somebody who's more knowledgeable and more capable than I am, who I'm in alignment with on values. For instance, my favorite high school teacher, I give her my education vote. My uncle, who's the retired Air Force guy, I give him my defense vote. And then those people can re-proxy up to their representative, to other people, including not-for-profits that have perspectives. I could give my environmental vote to Greenpeace. I can give my gun control vote to the NRA, which I probably would. I'd do both, right? But that's just an example of a new form of governance that has no big men in it, right? Or at least the big men it's very fluid. If someone acts like an asshole, you can always immediately pull your proxy and vote yourself or give your proxy to somebody else. So
Right.
maybe that defeats big men. Don't know. But if we know that big men is a plague upon humanity, which I will argue that it is and has been for 10,000 years, then one of the core design parameters of governance in GameB is to substantially reduce the risks that big men accumulate more power than they ought to have.
Right. I mean, there's this famous saying, I think it was The Dark Knight, the movie, some people just want to see the world burn, then there's this. And I mean, it's like, I'm not making a case for war. I'm just thinking, I mean, I like a peaceful world as much as the next guy, right? And I see that it's a Christian and it's a Protestant endeavor to refine ourselves morally and from our complexities and in our ways of dealing with the world. But at the same time, I know that looking at the psychodynamic of ourselves, we have libido, and the more we suppress libido on one side, it comes out on the other side, and sometimes in very destructive ways. And so the question is, like, do we find ways to channel this libido and this urge to destroy, and this urge to destroy, current structures in a way that it's not harmful anymore? And so that is such a deep psychological project. I mean, we're talking now before about, the societal project, but it's also a psychological project. Like what does it have to, how do we do this? Like from a from an education viewpoint, that we find ways to channel libido in a way that it doesn't find a destructive outlet, right?
And so,
yeah.
In the GameB world, here's how we think about that, which is that we have to, it's both a personal change and an institutional change spiral. And this, listeners will probably resonate with this. Lots of people go on these, hippie retreats or go hang out with a guru or something and get a little bit of personal change. They come back to their GameB world and the effect attenuates out pretty quickly. And that's what I call the individual change without the social scaffolding. If you were to undergo some amount of personal change and be embedded in a community that modeled that set of values, your probability of being able to maintain it is way higher. Second, we are constrained by the institutions we can build today by our GameB programming, right? If you create and stabilize and scaffold people who have a more pro-social way of being, then you can create entirely new governance modalities that assume these people with better ways of being, at least on average. But of course, being wise, keep in mind that there's going to still be 1% sociopaths. There's always 1% sociopaths. So your system has to not be, just happy, guppy horseshit. You have to also realize that it will always have internal people trying to subvert your system, and the system has to have an immune system against that. And so you can then see a spiral where some personal change, some institutional change, and then the institution, part of its reason in being is to increase the capacity of the human, which then allows you to build better institutions, which further improve the human. And that is the personal institutional spiral that we see as one of the key, the long-term drivers to get humanity out of this situation.
Right. And you do hope that will happen.
I mean, if it doesn't, there's no GameB. That is that is the core engine of GameB, basically.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think we touched on this point, before, not only today, but I think in a previous podcast. But I mean, how do you want to achieve that? Because, if you look at society as it is, and let's take a concrete example. You have, the Green Party in Germany, which is famously was founded as an anti-war party in the 70s and 80s, and a pro-environment, anti-war party that has shifted, and it's fairly left from progressive, what I can see. But it is absolutely pro-war, and they say things like, in terms of in relationship to Trump, the good news is that Trump won't end the war in Ukraine on the first day. And it's like, what are you saying? Is it a good day when he doesn't end the war? So there's something weird going on in this strata, in this society right now. And how do we get these GameB agents into the correct positions so they can change these systems, not only in politics, but in education, in economics?
Well, some GameB people disagree with me quite strongly about this, but my view is a waste of time to put GameB people into GameA structures. GameA is going to GameA, and per Buckminster Fuller, we need to build the alternative and hope they don't fucking burn the house down before the new house is built. From a game A perspective, we probably should be backing Ukraine, I would argue, right? Now, from a higher level perspective, there never should have ever been such a conflict. But once you have a big man, and if there wasn't another cartoon character of a big man that wasn't Putin, I don't know who it would be. But once you have that big man with control of 10,000 nuclear weapons and everything else, you've got to confront him. So you can't hop immediately from game A to systemic game B. You have to build game B gradually and have it supplant game A. Very, very difficult to actually change the dynamics of game A. They're just so strong.
Okay, so let me ask one additional question, because you mentioned Buckminster Fuller, one of the heroes of mine, basically. I've read his book Critical Path numerous times, and so like, what is the relationship for you between game B and a societal critical path? So with critical path, he specifically meant the time between 62, 63 and 69, when Kennedy was like saying, okay, no, we want to go to the moon and do the other thing, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. And then all, stratas of society, from the engineers to the astronauts to the people that work, in the offices and clean the toilets, work to a specific goal, namely to put man in some tin boxes on the moon. And this, led to some forces and to some enthusiasm and some crazy developments within this 7-year period. And he called that a critical path. And he was wondering kind of if that's a kind of outset or an idea for society as a whole, right? And the question is, if we have enough goals now in society, or if we need more goals where we can put, let's say, the warriors into work and work on something for the future.
Yeah, in the game B vision, those would be cooperations amongst membranes. And so always voluntary, always self-organizing, though it could come from a call from a person with a specific vision. Let's go to Mars, right? And if there's enough people in the game B world that want to go to Mars, they pool their excess capacity and invest it in the vision to go to Mars. Actually, going to Mars is a bad idea. We should really go to the asteroids, but there's no reason that we can't have that kind of, and that's what I said earlier, humanity needs to preserve the ability to do big, bold things, right?
Right.
If we've just lapsed into hippies and mud huts, not good, right? So I would want to make sure that game B continues to have the dynamics that lead to those kinds of transformational events.
But do you agree with the notion of a critical path for the future, that we need something like this, or is it something like outlandish?
That's an interesting question. I do agree that Project Apollo produced amazing number of interesting side effects, right? In terms of computers, in terms of medical knowledge, and in terms of rocket knowledge, et cetera. And so it had all kinds of interesting events, but if it hadn't happened, the world wouldn't be very different than it is. It was a bit of an accelerator in certain parts of the domain. But would our world be hugely different? We'd probably be 5 years behind in computer technology. Oh, well, right? Is that the end of the world? No. So I don't think it's as...
No, but the image, the photograph that was made on Apollo of the Earth, right, like hanging in space, basically. That
famous blue marble picture.
Yes, that image, that for many observers, that was the thing that transformed our consciousness, because we, at that point, we understood where we are and who we are, right? Because we could look at our planet. So that was the goal of the whole thing, not the technological achievement.
Of course, that was not the goal. That was a complete accidental.
Right. Yes, of course. Yes, right? But I mean, like, right? So that was.
So this is always important. Intentional causality versus side effects. Right. You can't predict the side effects, and so it was a great side effect. But I'm very familiar with Stuart Brand's argument. In fact, he was the one that popularized the picture, right? And it led to the counterculture. It led to environmentalism. It had all kinds of crazy effects. But it's a classic complex system. Butterfly wags his wings in Brazil, and we have a tornado in Texas. You could not, when Kennedy said we're going to the moon, he could not have envisioned that somebody accidentally took this picture. Somehow it got preserved. Stuart Brand, the maniac, and a great maniac, spent years trying to get his hand on the picture and publicizing it as the front cover of the Whole Earth catalog. I mean, I still remember that. So anyway, it's a very interesting point, but I don't think I think it's an incidental. It's an incidental along the road to the future. And such incidentals will continue to occur. I mean, the world is complex. We don't know what will happen. All we can do is steer a trajectory and respond to the reactions of a complex universe around us.
Right. Okay. But let me rephrase. Do you think that, a global critical path can substitute war or should substitute war?
Well, I think that, as I was arguing before, it's frankly more structural. We need to back away from big men in power. We need to find a way to find alternatives. And before we end, I actually have a couple of tangible alternatives on how to break military multipolar trap. And this is one that came up in a discussion between myself, Daniel Schmachtenberger, Brett Weinstein, and Jordan Hall. We were trying to think about how to break the top level multipolar traps. A couple of years ago, we had a several-hour discussion, and we concluded that probably the most powerful way to do it would be to go to radical transparency. Because one of the main drivers, particularly the multipolar trap, is uncertainty about the other guy, right? What is he building? How many tanks does he have? How many rockets? Are they ready to be launched on warning or not, et cetera? So there's two things going on. One is just happening as a side effect of everything else is satellite surveillance is getting much, much better, right? We can now see anybody mobilizing an army, for instance. It would be quite difficult to catch somebody by surprise. I mean, Biden gave very explicit warnings to the Ukrainians that the Ruskies were mobilizing. They chose not to believe him, but he knew. And that surveillance is getting better. But I believe we need something stronger. And so I would propose the following as a simple first way to start to defuse the military multipolar trap is to allow every country on Earth to appoint 100 universal inspectors. And these universal inspectors have the right on 4 hours notice to go absolutely anywhere on Earth and take a video of what they see there. And any country that stops an inspector is an outlaw, and nobody will trade with them. They are total pariah if you violate the universal inspector regime. And that alone would give us a big opportunity to back away from the multipolar trap. Now, we still have the big man problem. That's another problem, but at least we don't have the mutual uncertainty problem. Right. Okay, what do they got? What are they doing? And it'd be cheap. Let's say there's 200 countries times 100 inspectors, 20,000 inspectors. Let's say it costs to support an inspector $1 million a year. They fly around in private jets or something. $20 billion. $20 billion. A tiny fraction of any major country's military spending for the whole world, and substantially breaks the back of one of the binding forces of the military multipolar trap.
Right. Awesome. Jim, thank you so much for joining the conversation.
Thanks for asking. I enjoy talking about these things, it always produces some thoughts in my head as I tell the story.
Yeah, that's the idea, no, isn't it?
Absolutely.